La seduta è aperta.
The session has now reopened. Today, we have as our guest the Prime Minister of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki, who will be dealing with the theme of the future of Europe with us. Welcome, Prime Minister. As you know, and as my colleagues know, Parliament wishes to be at the very heart of the debate on the future of our continent, of our union. We are going through a particularly difficult period. Europe needs to change, and we must not give up this gift which we have, because it has guaranteed peace and freedom for more than 50 years now. We want the European Parliament to be at the heart of the debate, the political debate. We wish to be protagonists. We would like the European Parliament to have the prerogatives of any national parliament in the world. And over the past few weeks, we've let our voice be heard with regard to immigration, and we've asked that Council adopt a provision with regard to the right to asylum, and this is one of the important topics for Parliament. It will be important for us during this debate to listen to your ideas, your proposals, and what the Polish government intend to do in order to contribute to the building of a future Europe. There are many proposals which are on the table: the European Parliament's proposals, the Commission's, the different member states, and that is why it is important to listen to what the member states think. We wish to have an exchange of views, and this is a new method, a new face-to-face dialogue between the European Parliament and the heads of the national governments. Thank you for having accepted our invitation, and I'll pass you over the floor. Thank you.
Vi ricordo che il dibattito.
Could I remind you that the debate will finish at 11:20 today, because then I will be going to welcome the President of Angola. And you can enroll according to the usual system, using your card and pressing the appropriate button.
The floor.
Szanowny Panie Przewodniczący.
President Tajani, Minister
Estadler, Szanowny Panie Przewodniczący.
Karolina Estadler, who was supposed to be here, Mr. Dombrovskis, members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honour for me, as the Prime Minister of the Polish government, to have the opportunity to speak to you here in Strasbourg and to give you the Polish point of view on the challenges that face the European Parliament. It's also an honour to speak to the European Parliament. Amongst all of the EU institutions, it is the Parliament that reflects the voice of its citizens expressed in universal elections. The European Parliament is an important part of the EU's functioning, not just because it has an enormous influence on the shape of European legislation, but also because it's a forum in which discussions take place that set the course for the European Union for the next few years. Poland is celebrating the 550th anniversary of its first parliament and the 100th anniversary of its independence. We were one of the first countries to give full democratic rights to women as well. And this shows how Poland has deep roots in parliamentarism and the rule of law. National parliaments are the voice of the sovereign and the lifeblood of democracy. The discussion on the future of Europe is one of the most important debates that we can have, particularly on this, the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, which began the very difficult history of the 20th century in Europe. The cataclysms of 2 world wars and the genocidal crimes saw the free countries begin with a historic project 60 years ago, aiming to find what could bring us together. If it hadn't been for the Iron Curtain and the tragic division of Europe, Poland would also have been one of the founding fathers of the European community. That's what the Polish government in exile had wanted at the time. Polish society was therefore kept outside of the first stage in European integration and sustainable development. So now, as a fully fledged member of the EU, we want to do our bit to aim to create a constructive programme for the future of our continent. We have our expectations, as every country in the European Union does, but we also have plenty to offer. You can't understand the continuity of Europe without understanding its Greek, Roman and Judeo-Christian roots. Without those, we would never have achieved what we have achieved today, this feeling of universalism, for example, that you can see here, the diversity that we cherish. Now, these slogans are not just empty words in Europe. Our continent has been shaped by its culture and institutions over hundreds of years, and respecting national identities is part of the trust that must be built in the EU. Constitutional pluralism in Article 4 of the treaty is one of the great values of the EU, and every country has a right to set up its legal system in line with its own traditions. The idea of Europe, for me, was always a reason of state. As a young man, I was part of the anti-communist opposition fighting for freedom and democracy. But the same went for my work in the European Integration Committee, working on Poland's accession to the EU in the 90s. 30 years since the fall of communism, we're still part of a difficult process of sewing together the different parts of Europeans' history and memory. But we mustn't lose sight of the joint goal, which is the safety and security of our citizens and economic development. Members of the House, in the last few years, the European Union has been dealing with a number of existential crises: the financial crisis, the banking crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, or Russian aggression. 5 no's in referendums and a change in the political landscape in member states. All of these things go to show that the European project needs a new openness. Some have said that the European Union always go through crises, and all changes to the treaties arise from those crises and reinforce it. However, the situation today seems to be without precedent, different to the 70s or the 80s or the first decade of this century. That's because it's not just one crisis, but a accumulation of several crises happening at the same time. And any response to those crises has to be based on a sound understanding of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. We know that a lot of Europeans aren't so enthusiastic about integration anymore, and some are outright against. You can be offended by that, you can close your eyes to it, you can say it's just a marginal group, but it's not going to change the reality of the fact that it's not a marginal group. This is a real message that we've made mistakes and that we have to correct those mistakes. Instead of wringing our hands about the threat, we should start thinking about how we got into this situation where many Europeans no longer like the direction that the EU is going in. The answer to that question has been given many times and in many ways, but I think that the best answer is to be found in all of the major changes in our history. People have a freedom gene in their DNA. They want to decide on their future, their children's future, their family's future, their society's future for themselves. And when they see that they're losing that influence and that they don't have any influence on the future of Europe and the world, then they're going to oppose what's happening. I think that we all agree, more or less, that European integration is one of the most significant phenomena in the history of not only Europe but the world. However, if citizens don't share that view, then no further integration can be possible. Therefore, their voice has to be taken into account. If the European project is to move forward, therefore, its democratic legitimacy has to be reinforced. You can call that populism if you like, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to answer the questions asked by citizens and their expectations. It's all about the very meaning of democracy. Europe is going through a democratic enlightenment. We have to renew the social contract that's been such a success since the Second World War. That contract meant rebuilding a feeling of security, rebuilding the economy, offering prosperity to all. Today, we need an covenant, an annex to that contract, showing that our children will also have a better life than we had. We have to build confidence in the European project. So how do we answer this democratic change? Well, Europe has to be up to the challenges of the modern age without giving up on the duties it already has to its citizens. To deal with all of these challenges, we have to rebalance the relationship between the member states and the EU institutions. The Union of Nations 2.0, according to de Gaulle's vision, is one way of doing this, and that's Poland's proposal. An intelligent adjustment would focus on three things. First of all, the Union 4.0 would be the bridgehead of the fourth industrial revolution. The second thing would be a secure European Union, which is aware of the geopolitical challenges that it faces and have a single answer to them, where we would speak with one voice. Next, a union of citizens with solidarity and supporting our citizens against the power of global corporations. Let me just say a little more about those. Yes, we need more cooperation when we face the challenges of the global economy. Europe needs to set ambitious goals, an audacious budget for the single market. The finalisation of the single market, the increase in productivity, can only be achieved if competitiveness is increased in a fully integrated single market. According to the European Parliament's own analysis, in the last 14 years, it has contributed to a growth in GDP of 250 billion euro, ceteris paribus. Services, for example, are responsible for 70% of the Union's GDP, but only 25% of trade within the EU. The Services Directive from 2006 needs to be revised so that it can reflect services as they are provided today. There can't be a single market unless we fight the disparities, unless we have an ambitious cohesion policy. This can't be a one-way street for underdeveloped countries. It's about developing the single market, which brings enormous trade benefits to those, including to those who are calling for it to be limited. Our calculations, and the Union's own calculations, show that 75 cents in every euro go back to netto payers in the form of orders and business. Commissioner Oettinger quoted that figure recently. So let's be very clear. Limiting cohesion policy is populism. Doesn't matter whether you call it pro or anti-European populism. Cohesion policy and an ambitious fight with disparities in the Union is a win-win strategy, something that's good for all our members. Fighting inequality is something that can be done through transfers in the cohesion policy, yes, but also by bolstering our tax system, closing loopholes in the VAT system and clamping down on tax havens in the EU. VAT income revenue is, after all, EU own resources. The Commission has said that tax avoidance and evasion is worth €200 billion a year, and if you include VAT, it's 150 billion more than that. That is the big elephant in the room, and if it isn't, then I don't know what is. In Poland, we've managed to do this. We have dealt with VAT fraudsters who are stealing VAT from our citizens, including lawyers' offices who were avoiding paying their taxes for years and who were getting around a weak legal system. Indeed, the judiciary was particularly passive in the face of these fraudsters. They often had very low penalties, sometimes suspended penalties, and we heard that it had to be like that. There was no way of challenging it. But we've shown that you can do something about this. We've done something positive for Polish and European tax revenue. We have to set out what our goal is and then put in place measures that will help us achieve it. And that's what we're offering Europe. A practical solution that has already been tried and tested. We've talked about this in the Council on a number of occasions. Mafia, terrorists and crooks stealing from member states whose judiciaries don't work properly is something that we've shown you can fight against. We've also managed to pretty much eradicate poverty in young people and children. That's another of our contributions. Within the EU, we also have to cooperate in order to challenge tax avoidance, like the digital tax and tax havens. I was talking with President Tajani this morning, and I talked about EU own resources. Poland supports the idea that I know most of the European Parliament supports, that is, that the EU should have sufficient own resources. It's essentially, therefore, to restrict tax havens, not just individual countries, but their existence undermines the EU's existence because billions are leaking out of our tax systems and that money doesn't come back to citizens as a result. We chase tax fraudsters or tax evaders at an individual level, and we should therefore also be chasing up on systematic or even state tax havens and tax avoiders. It seems logical to me that we should have also a European anti-monopoly office for dealing with competition issues. We need new competition rules, perhaps also sectoral rules adapted to the digital age. Google and Facebook could be described as part of essential facilities or critical infrastructure now. The same as distribution infrastructure in the energy market. None of us, none of people in this room could imagine life without these instruments. They're essential for functioning in the digital age, and our legislative framework has to catch up with that reality. A new investment plan has been put forward by President Juncker, and it has been a success. Growth is up, and the European Strategic Investment Fund has also generated further investments in the amount of €300 billion. We shouldn't limit ourselves to that, but we should also transform it into a further ambitious tool. We need strategic investment, not just because we're coming out of a crisis, but so that we can be competitive in the future. The European Investment Bank has warned that the European Union is suffering from a chronic lack of investment in infrastructure, where expenditure is lower than it has been in many years. The investment the investment gap is 600 billion euro, and until that hole is filled, we're not going to be able to compete with other global powers. Another strategic goal is the European energy transformation, which means linking competitiveness on price with geopolitical realism. What does that mean? What do we need? We must invest in innovation. Europe needs to create the biggest clean tech fund in the world and make sure that the energy transition becomes a rational proposition for businesses around Europe. These things are going to be essential if we're going to be competitive in the future. The European route to a low-carbon economy, or even a zero-emissions economy, is certainly a worthy goal, a road to a clean environment and healthy citizens. Perhaps in Poland we are aware of the importance of this, and that's why we've introduced measures to clean up our air and fight against smog. However, with the new limitations that the EU has imposed, I call on you to remember that our countries have started from a different place. In 1989, Poland's economy was based on coal and heavy industry. All the same, Poland made great efforts to meet the emissions set out in the Kyoto Protocol of 30%, and we, even though our target had originally only been 5%, so we were 6 times better than that. We want to participate in the energy transformation. However, it has to be based on equality of opportunity and take into account the differences between our economies. It also needs to offer different instruments to support the different member states. For many years, Poland didn't have the opportunity to change to natural gas because it only came from one direction, from Russia. Any attempt to use blue energy sources would have been a risk to our national security. Efforts in Eastern Europe could all be undermined by the Nord Stream 2 project. This is not an economic project, it's a political project. The European Union doesn't need Nord Stream 2. It brings with it a heightened risk of instability in Eastern Europe and gives Russia a great deal of influence on European economics and policy. So we have to look at the reality of the global economy. Machine learning, the 4.0 industrial revolution, innovation, all of these things can drive our economy forward. The internal combustion engine has played a great role in industrialization in the West. Europe built up Airbus, which together with Boeing is the big global aviation player. Now we need to do the same sort of thing in technology. Poland would like to take part in this sort of project. A vehicle for reindustrialization in the 21st century could be electromobility. This is a project that's moving forward but needs more support from member states. Only 1.5% of cars in Europe at the moment are electric cars. If we really want to bring emissions down, then we're going to have to make bigger steps forward. It's not science fiction to say that in 10 years, 25% or 30% of cars could be electric cars in the EU. And if we want the technologies of the future to develop, then we have to continue developing the European capital market, particularly for SMEs. Poland supports that development on the market. Growth can also be achieved through intelligent development of the EU economy and an adaptation of the EU project. Now, I said that the second point was European security. The second part of this contract with citizens has to be security. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of geopolitical threats. Terrorism, the Russian hybrid war in Ukraine and elsewhere, interference in the democratic process of countries of the West, and events like what we saw in Salisbury or Russia's involvement in Syria. What Russia has done in the Ukraine threatens the architecture of Eastern Europe, but it's aimed at destabilizing the West. Georgia was subject to a similar attack a few years ago, and that shows clearly that what Russia's doing is not coincidence but part of a long-term strategy. The only fault, inverted commas, for these countries was to choose a European economic and political model, and that shows that the European Eastern Partnership is something that the whole EU needs to get behind, because it's essential for our safety, including that of our southern countries. We want peace and development on the borders of the EU as well, and Europe has to react with all the means at its disposal to these developments. We also want to develop our defence capacity. The amount of money that goes towards budget spending, to defence spending, and NATO needs to be increased. This is a relationship that has to be cultivated. The power of the West will always be its unity. We should deal with our disagreements in the spirit of partnership. After all, it was America that helped in the First and Second World War and stopped the Soviet Union from attacking Western Europe. The global imbalances that the Americans are talking about are a fact, and they have to be dealt with at global level. I'm therefore happy to see that the European Defence Fund is being set up, and the whole PESC setup, which is going to be a supranational way of investing in the defence sector. This will help us collaborate more closely and develop defence technology. Cybersecurity is another challenge in this area. We know that it's absolutely crucial for democracies, which can be attacked through cybercrime during elections. No EU country is safe from external interference, and our citizens aren't safe from that interference either. Bank accounts and their whole digital identity is under threat from attack. We have to fight together for safety in the cyberspace. The Council summit last week, ladies and gentlemen, has shown that the EU can be realistic and can rebuild citizens' trust. Citizens who want safe borders and who want the right to influence migration policy. The EU is dealing with a flow of migrants from different directions, and it's only a flexible and intelligent approach to the migratory flows that we're going to be able to rebuild citizens' trust in the EU. Poland is the new home for 1.5 million Ukrainians, many of whom have escaped from Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine. They may not be registered in Poland as refugees, but that's simply because administratively it's very easy for them to get work permits and build their lives through supporting our and the EU's economies through work. Migration from the Middle East and Africa is going to increase, and that's why the EU must react, creating stabilization and development in those regions. We need a new Marshall Plan for Europe, for Africa, and we need also to combat illegal human trafficking towards Europe. The EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa is one instrument, but we would propose more, a European Development Fund for Africa. Poland would like to give the fishing rod rather than the fish to Africa, and we would be happy to contribute in a disproportionately high amount as compared to our GDP. This is not just a declaration, but we're also involved in the European Resilience Initiative. The European Union is the greatest success of Europe since the Second World War. Now we have to look again at renewing the EU contract with its citizens to guarantee security and prosperity. So let me say something about the third point I raised earlier, namely a socially just European Union for citizens. We can't forget one fundamental principle that our community is based on: social justice. That principle is the overriding principle of our society, and it can be found in the EU Treaty and the Polish Constitution. These are not just hollow words. You can't talk about social development unless you deal with exclusion, poverty and inequality. It's important that we have ambitious social policy to fight these inequalities. What we've achieved in the last 2.5 years in Poland shows that if you change the paradigm, you can change the paradigm, and that our strategy has brought excellent effects. We have unemployment under 4% according to Eurostat. Public debt has fallen for the first time in 30 years. The budget deficit is shrinking, and at the same time we have the most ambitious social policy since the fall of communism and the victory of solidarity. We're also cutting red tape for SMEs and citizens. We're reducing taxes, but only for small and medium-sized companies, not for big corporations. We're also creating a sound financial policy by tackling the mafia, tax fraudsters, and by closing loopholes in the tax system. We've also created the biggest support system for technology and information in Eastern Europe. Populist capitalism means innovation and solidarity. The liberalization of trade has created economic growth, and it can't be condemned out of hand. However, economic growth hasn't been to the benefit of everybody to the same degree. I'm not talking about protectionism. The way to deal with inequality is to invest in human capital. Education determines people's future earnings. We must invest in human capital, and that ties to the second challenge that we are linked to: automation and robotization. I'm not going to suggest that we have people working in all posts in the 21st century or block innovation. However, there is a fear that people will be made unemployed by robots, and we have to address that fear. Technological progress will create a demand for new professions, but they will be a different type of job than those in the past. They will require, for example, high level of skills, and that requires a high level of education. Robotization will mean that capital will be more important in creating jobs and businesses, and we must make sure that capital is distributed fairly, as would be the revenue from that business. Thomas Piketty has shown that capital is very concentrated, and that concentration will continue to intensify. Digitization has led to a winner-takes-all distribution of wealth. Fewer people are taking more of the profit. The digital age, the platform economy, create an opportunity for monopolists. The network effect has led to global giants who don't have any competition. We must combat inequality in the EU, and that's really one of the big arguments that we can put in the current debate on the EU budget. We need new policies for these new challenges, but their funding shouldn't be done at the expense of cohesion and social policy, which is fundamental to the EU and to the treaty provisions. The example of Poland in the last 2.5 years have shown that if you take the right strategy, you can change both society and the economy. The European Union can be a symbol of European dreams once again, but this is only going to be possible if we make the right choice, and if we can overcome our divisions, and if we can remember that despite our divisions we are joined by European identity. In the European Parliament we've heard about European sovereignty. Yes, Europe should be an entity on the global stage, defending its interests. It should be powerful so as to better defend our interests. However, European sovereignty cannot mean building up Europe at the expense of the force of member states, because the force of a sovereign Europe comes from the force of its member states. Weak member states and countries who feel they're being ignored would be a recipe for indifference to the EU, in which the EU is a problem and not a solution. Poland will do its utmost to make sure that that scenario doesn't happen. The EU is an important way of building solidarity, prosperity and security for us. John Paul II said that at the root of a united Europe there were two lungs, an eastern lung and a western lung, and that they were both important for the old continent. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union is an open book, and we all have at least one page to write in that book. It's not a finished piece of work. Walter Hallstein, the first director of the Commission, said in 1963 in a speech called Europe Under Construction, said that Europe is a living organism that is continued developing. And with that in mind, we shouldn't engage in determinism that says there's only one future for the EU and forcing us to transfer competences from national level to EU level until we end up with some sort of super state. The EU is an international experiment looking for solutions that weren't available to nation states. Discussion, cooperation, negotiation, this is the DNA of the European project. On the basis of those rules, we have the foundations that were laid by de Gasperi, Adenauer, Schuman and Jean Monnet, the founding fathers. We shouldn't try to gene splice the nature of the EU, therefore, but rather look for new ways to work together to guarantee security and development for our countries and prosperity for our societies. Integration was never a goal in itself for the EU. It was simply to guarantee peace, prosperity, development, democracy and justice. The European community is now at a junction where it has to listen to what its citizens are saying to it. Wrapping up, let me conclude by saying we have to listen to citizens' concern. We have to hear the hope that they still hold out for the EU. We need to guarantee them security, development, solidarity and peace. Europe has to be open to citizens, giving everyone an equal chance and showing solidarity to the vulnerable. A united Europe in the face of threats which respects the will of nation states. The European Parliament is the best institution to have the citizens' voice heard and understood for the good of free nation states and for the good of the future of the EU. Thank you.
Procedo ora alla chiusura del sistema.
The system now for the electronic registration of the vote for the Catch the Eye is completed. And now I pass the floor over to the Vice President of the European Commission, Commissioner Dombrovskis.
Honourable Mr. President, Honourable Mr. Prime Minister, honourable members. Speaking on behalf of President Juncker, who cannot be here today, allow me to start by thanking Prime Minister Morawiecki for taking part in today's debate on the future of our Union. It is an honour for me to be here. Poland is a country I have close affinity to, and I say this partly because I have some Polish roots myself. My last name is in fact a Latvian version of Dabrowski, a name so synonymous with your country, your history and even your national anthem. But I also say this because throughout my life and career I had been always full of admiration for Poland and its people. As Prime Minister, I made it a point to deepen our partnership, which goes back long into history. People of my age in Latvia and right across the Baltic Sea region grew up inspired by Polish workers, students and intellectuals who had formed the Solidarność movement to fight for change. And it is thanks to these values, to this courage and to the determination of your people that Poland took its rightful place at the heart of the European Union. And since then, Poland has given so much to Europe. Since we are in this chamber, it is only right to mention Bronisław Geremek, a great Polish patriot who worked tirelessly for European integration. He was both an architect of Polish freedom and builder of Europe. I also think of Marie Skłodowska-Curie, who gives her name to one of Europe's most successful programmes for young researchers. I would mention many more examples to show how Poland shaped our Union. And this is why it is so important for Europe to keep its solidarity pledge to Poland. And Europe has shown its solidarity in many different ways. This is why, for instance, Poland was allocated €86 billion in the current EU budget for European structural and investment funds, far more than any other country. This has helped to build, for example, 13,000 kilometres of roads and allowed more than 9 million people to gain access to high-speed internet. And these investments are paying off. Poland's economy has gone from strength to strength. The Polish success story is also built on the benefits of being part of the biggest single market in the world. Every day, Polish companies trade and work with businesses right across our Union. Since 2004, Polish exports have tripled to with 80% of exports going to other EU countries. And Europe will keep supporting and showing solidarity in the future. In our proposals for the next long-term budget, Poland will continue to receive the most cohesion funding, even though the total amount will be somewhat reduced to €72.7 billion. That works out as €270 per person per year, more than double the EU average of €120. That investment will be focused in areas where there is the biggest potential for Poland, whether it be innovation, small and medium businesses or renewable energies. But at the same time, Europe must also continue to make good on its promise on security and prosperity. This is why we have focused our proposals for the new multiannual financial framework on areas where we can achieve more together and which are crucial also to Poland's future. For example, we want to spend 22 times as much on defence as we currently do, with €13 billion allocated to the European Defence Fund, which Poland has been a strong advocate for. This strengthens our ability to act, avoids duplicate structures and saves taxpayers' money. At the same time, we also want to invest in our future growth. We have proposed to increase investments in digitisation and networks by 9 times the current amounts to €12 billion. We are also strengthening our current currency by firmly anchoring the euro area in the EU budget. We are holding discussions with all EU member states, not just those that have already introduced the euro, on how best to strengthen our economic and monetary union. We are using new budgetary instruments to support all countries, including those member states on the road towards euro membership. This will be done in a fully inclusive and transparent way, and I look forward to working with Poland across all these areas. Honourable members, as we look to our future, Poland's place should be firmly at the heart of our Union. This was a choice made by almost 80% of Poles in the referendum almost exactly 15 years ago. That day Polish people made a free, clear and decisive choice. They choose peace and democracy, and they choose the values and fundamental rights that define our Union and that define the people of your great country. And at the heart of that lies the respect for the rule of law. The law is our best tool to defend our freedoms, to work for social justice, to peacefully settle differences and protect the most vulnerable in our societies. The justice system is a guarantor of our democracy and our fundamental rights. This is also what binds our Union together. As Walter Hallstein used to say, the European Union is at its heart a community of law. That community is the foundation of everything we have achieved and everything we still have to do together. This is why, if there is a systemic threat to the rule of law, we cannot simply turn a blind eye, we cannot simply say it is a purely national issue. So where the separation of powers is weakened in one country or where the independence of the judiciary is challenged in another, it becomes a European issue which affects our whole community. This is why, through the tireless work of Frans Timmermans, the Commission has worked closely with the Polish government to address the concerns on a number of new laws which pose a systemic threat to the rule of law. Dialogue almost comes first, and dialogue has shown that progress can be made. The Prime Minister and his government have shown willingness to amend the laws on a number of issues, for instance on the retirement age of judges. On behalf of the Commission, I thank him for his effort and his cooperation. We always remain open for dialogue, but so far it has not been enough. I hope that last week's hearing will lead to further changes in Polish legislation and that we will not see 40% of the Supreme Court judges replaced. Europe will never turn its back on Poland or on the Polish people. The Commission will always stand up to support them, and our hand will be always outstretched to the Polish government. Mr. Prime Minister, the Commission counts on your leadership to continue working with us and delivering the real changes needed. Poland has shown how strong its leadership can be in our Union and in the world. We will see this again in December when Katowice hosts the United Nations Climate Conference, COP24 as it is known. It is more important than ever for Europe to lead from the front in the fight against climate change. We are doing that by focusing on green and sustainable investment. Through our Capital Markets Union and Sustainable Finance Action Plan, we want to unlock a systemic change in investment culture so that sustainability comes first. Here again, Poland has shown the way. In 2016, Poland became the first sovereign to issue a green sovereign bond. Through this leadership and climate diplomacy, Poland is helping to send a message that the Paris Agreement is here to stay and that Europe is here to lead. Katowice itself is an example of that. It is a region historically reliant on coal and heavy industry, which is turning itself into a leader in innovation, sustainable investment and new technologies. I can think of no better priority for the future of our Union than the health of our planet and the health of our economies. Poland must be at the heart of these efforts and must stay at the heart of our future. As Marie Skłodowska-Curie said, nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now it's time to understand more so that we may fear less. This applies as much today as ever it has to Poland, to Europe and our common future. Dziękuję. Thank you.
We now go on to the speakers representing the various political groups. Could I ask you to stick to the time you have been allotted, because every extra minute which you use means that colleagues from your group will have less speaking time. So on behalf of the group of the European People's Party, Manfred Weber for 6 minutes.
Mr. Prime Minister, Europe is always about dialogue, and that's why it's good to have you here to discuss with Poland, with the Polish Prime Minister, about the future of Europe. And it was absolutely not Europe that brought democracy to Poland. It was Poland who brought democracy to Europe with the first modern codified constitution in Europe in 1791. And the principle of the separation of power was included in this first constitution. And for these principles, the Polish people stood really strong even in dark times, Second World War, under the oppression of the Soviet Union. John Paul II has said in Warsaw when standing in Victory Square in 1979, there can be no just Europe without the independence of a democratic Poland marked on the map. More than 10 million people, a quarter of the population of Poland, was a member of Solidarność. Together with Lech Walesa, they fought for freedom, democracy, and they laid also the groundwork for a free and open, unified, democratic Europe. And that's why we think that Poland is we believe in a Poland that is based on the ideas of Lech Walesa and of Jean Paul II. We admire what they did for Poland and for Europe. But today, Mr. Prime Minister, today there are so much questions on the table. People all over Europe and in your country, yesterday the demonstrations out in the street, there are so much questions on the table. For example, the question why is the state TV in Poland today more a propaganda TV and not anymore a free, independent media? Why does your government dismiss churches because of their political opinion? You refer to Walter Hallstein. He would be very surprised if he would assess that today nobody knows whether the president of the Supreme Court of Poland is still in office or not. We have uncertainty there. Nobody knows exactly what is today the situation. Why did another member state have to refer to the European Court of Justice on a court case, fearing that Polish citizens do not enjoy the right of a free and fair trial in your country? Why is this happening? And why do peaceful protesters like Władysław Frasyniuk face imprisonment for carrying roses, while nationalists who attacked peaceful protesters are not even facing trial? That are the questions on the table. And I think you missed today an opportunity to clarify these questions. Here is Europe together. You missed today an opportunity to clarify these questions. The founder of the free and democratic Poland, Lech Walesa, has recently said, in the 18th, there was no freedom without solidarity. Today, he said, there is no freedom without the rule of law. The rule of law is in the very roots of Poland and the hearts of the Polish people. And Europe will not turn its back to the Polish people. If the Polish government does not preserve the great Polish achievements, Europe will do so. Ladies and gentlemen, there is another Poland. There is a Poland of the demonstrators, the people in Poland who went out in the street. There is a Poland who is welcoming 18 million tourists who enjoy the freedom of movement, the tourists who admire Poland and the culture of your great country. There is a Poland who is welcoming 4,000 NATO soldiers on the idea to protect our European Union together. There is another Poland, and sometimes I am wondering myself whether you speak here as a PiS government or whether you speak here as a Polish Prime Minister. Do you really have this second Poland in mind? And I also want to welcome some of these NGOs here on the tribune. They are invited by Michel Boni. So thanks for this. And having all this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, you talk about sovereignty. You talk about sovereignty. I want to ask you, when we talk about sovereignty and win back the sovereignty, is then the anti-EU atmosphere which is created in Poland, in a way to say that Brussels is the new Moscow, is this really creating an atmosphere of sovereignty for Poland? And if you talk about the content, and a few of the things I absolutely agree with, Marshall Plan for Africa and so on, when you talk, for example, about taxation, about the initiatives you want to do there, do you really think that your approach of an EU of the nations is really a thing which can work? When you have the unanimous vote in the taxation field in mind, we see that in the Council a lot of initiatives, good initiatives, are blocked because there is always one single member state blocking everything on the taxation thing and so on. Do you really think that such a Europe will work? I tell you, when you talk about the EU of 4.0, a new Europe which is listening to the citizens, I tell you, there is already a Europe which is listening to the citizens, and that is this chamber, the European Parliament. We are representing the citizens of the European Union. We don't need another Europe. I think our Europe is already working very well. Yesterday we had the Bulgarian presidency present, Boyko Borisov, a colleague of you who was present, and who gave us an overview of what we achieved together in the last 6 months in the interest of the citizens of the European Union. And again, in the Council meetings last week, we experienced that the nation states cannot find any more common ground to go further. And that's why I strongly believe that the European Union, which was founded by Adenauer, you refer to this, which is based on the institutions in the European level, this Europe works, and a Europe of egoism and nationalism cannot deliver to the interests of the people of the European Union. And let me say, Mr. President, let me say a final word. I want to conclude with a personal remark. Mr. Prime Minister, because of your PiS propaganda, of governmental propaganda, I never took the floor here in this House when we spoke about Poland. because I was afraid that my German background can be misused to attack my friends in Poland and others who are fighting there for rule of law and freedom, can be used that the Germans are telling us. That was we experienced sometimes in Poland. The Germans are telling us. I was afraid to take here the floor. And I want to tell you, I'm not speaking here as a German member of the European Parliament. I speak here because 219 colleagues voted for me as group leader of this group. I want to fight for the interests of the citizens of the European Union. And that is what we have to do, not to decide between good and bad Europeans. Let's discuss about the future of this continent. Let's stick together. Let's not divide anymore. That would be a great message if we would hear this from a Polish Prime Minister. Thank you so much.
On behalf of the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Udo Bullmann.
Dear Prime Minister, welcome to the European Parliament. You were saying we started from different places in the recent European history. Yes, this is true. You quoted John Paul II, the Eastern lung, the Western lung. Yes, I can very much identify with this picture. I would add we are still in one body, and we need both the eastern part as well as the western part. But the question on the table today is, what is the Polish contribution to this well-functioning of the eastern lung? Today, dear colleagues, the President of the Constitutional Court, Judge Gersdorf in Poland, went back to work. I sent her the greetings of the European Parliament, and I sent her the greetings of Europe, because she is obviously paying tribute to the Polish Constitution. She is obviously full of this democratic enlightenment you were talking about. Today, as yesterday, people in Warsaw massively take the streets to express their right of freedom. They are obviously full of this freedom gene you were talking about. This is important. We want to see a healthy Poland contributing to this Eastern lung, and we are waiting for you to give answers to the questions we have expressed by the colleagues, expressed by the Commission, expressed especially by our friend Frans Timmermans, whom we fully support. On a lot of issues, you raised rightly questions where we can fully agree. Talk about the future of Europe. Question industrial politics. Question the future of cohesion. Talking about cultural diversity, security politics, energy security. Rightly so. But why is it necessary raising these questions and at the same time undermining the European values on which our new project of the European Union is based on? You cannot do that in the same time, raising the questions of the future and appealing to the unity of the West, which is a value-based unity, and at the same time hope that we can collaborate for the best interest of our citizens. No, Poland has to come back in the center of the European Union, and you have to contribute to our values and their development in the best interest of our citizens. Herr Premierminister, lassen Sie mich.
Prime Minister, nevertheless, at this point I should say something as a German Social Democrat. Like Mr. Weber, I've been elected by my colleagues here in this House within the Social Democrat group to speak on behalf of our group. You have no idea about how closely the future of Poland society and Poland's citizens are to all of the members in our group. You are close to our hearts. Everyone in my delegation wants to see Poland in the centre of Europe. We want you to do your bit, but please don't destroy the democratic culture in your country and then come back to the to this house and say that you're trying to try to protect our values and help us in the future.
On behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformers, the floor to Mr. Legutko.
Thank you, Mr. President, Prime Minister. Well, this, as you could see this or hear, this chamber is hopelessly predictable. The title of your speech was "The Future of Europe," but apparently no one is interested in the future of Europe here, but they are indulging in the favourite pastime, which is Poland bashing. You could have just as well recited songs. You could have just as well recited Shakespeare's sonnets. It would have exactly the same effect. And yes, you can see how it's difficult to get through with the arguments, because there is a thick wall of lies, half-truths, mystifications, like this ridiculous story about arresting a man for carrying roses. I mean, it just boggles the mind, you know, when one hears something like it. And every day, you know, we have to do with such idiotic stories that are absolutely groundless. And this also shows that this chamber, I think, is, as I said it before, it's completely resistant to listening to arguments. I mean, if you never hear counter arguments. You hear, you know, heckling, booing, you know, mud throwing. I mean, that's the usual reaction. So there is a very deep, I would say, refusal to know here in this chamber, and this, in a way, I can continue making a more general point. I mean, you were talking, Prime Minister, you were mentioning a democratic awakening in Europe. Yes, there is a democratic awakening, and at the same time there is an increasing number of people who say that the European Union is going in the wrong direction. It's over 40% now, in some countries above 50%. And here, I came here and I listened to this self-indulgent and self-serving comments. We are so good, we are so responsive to citizens. Are all these people insane? I mean, are they all being fooled by some demagogues? No, the reaction of these people is the final effect of what is being said and done here. I mean, this arrogance, this self-serving arrogance is becoming more and more unacceptable. So yes, I think that when I hear about the separation of powers in Poland, the problem with the separation of powers, I mean, come on, we have a commissioner who is representative of the executive body, and the commissioner is telling the Polish parliament, the Polish courts, what to do with this and this law, or how this law should be changed. Is that a separation of powers? Is that an example of separation of powers? There's a blatant violation of the separation of powers. You see, that's the debate European Parliament style. I suggest that you start putting order in your own house. Yesterday we were prevented from having an exhibition on Józef Piłsudski, one of the founders of Polish independence. There is a censorship. This is not the first time. There is a well-established practice of censorship in this Parliament, and you seem to be quite serene about it. You do not really care, because this censorship serves the interest of the majority. People are being punished here. Fortunately, recently, the court reversed the decision of the European Parliament, but that continues. So I suggest, before you really start finger pointing Poland, please make this House a more open and a more receptive place for all points of view to be debated and considered here. That's my request. I know that has no chance whatsoever, but I just have to say it. Had to say it.
Onorevole Legutko.
Mr. Legutko, since you mentioned my name for the Korwin-Mikke question, could I remind you that I applied a sanction to the Member of Parliament, not because the member was Polish. As you know, I never, ever granted a favour to one group as opposed to another, to one Member of Parliament as opposed to another. I have always treated the members of this House on an equal footing, in an identical fashion, those who voted for me and those who did not. Now, you mentioned an attack on the polls. Now, I sanctioned Korwin-Mikke, and whatever the court decides, I consider unacceptable that a parliament in this House says that a woman is an inferior being simply because she was born as a woman. I would never accept that. I don't care. I would not accept the ruling. I respect it, but I don't accept it. And I would not accept that a member, if somebody says that somebody is inferior because they're Jewish, because they're of a different colour. All human beings are equal. I know that you're a Christian, and I'm saying this as a Christian, as a practicing Catholic. So there is no, I don't wish to polemicize in any way against Poland and the Poles. I respect all Polish citizens. Here, I did not sanction Korwin-Mikke because he was a Pole. He could have been Italian, French, or whatever. I would have applied the same measure. Now, you refer to this attitude vis-à-vis the Poles. This is not at all true. I never adopted a negative attitude vis-à-vis Poles. That should be quite clear.
Prego, andiamo avanti con il dibattito.
So let's proceed with the debate, please.
Prego, onorevole, qual è il problema? Mi dica.
What's the problem?
Chciałem odnieść się do tych słów jako
I just wanted to say something about this. I'm a deputy of Mr. Korwin-Mikke, and you talked about breaking the law. Well, you should resign because his rights were violated. He was accused unfairly, and somebody should answer for that. Heads need to roll, and you should resign. You have broken the law, and you shouldn't be in post. A member has a mandate and can say whatever they like and express their view. You are maliciously twisting his words. You're not entitled to do that because as chair and president of this House, you're supposed to be neutral.
I have always been neutral, dear colleague. Now, if you want heads roll, fine, but I don't like to do that. I don't want any head to roll. Now, I stick to what I decided to do as a human being. Women are on an equal footing with everybody else, and our colleague Mika said things that simply cannot be accepted. And let's proceed with the debate. On behalf of the group of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats, Mr. Verhofstadt.
So I have to tell you, I have so many times spoken about Poland in this plenary that today I'm going to concentrate myself more on the future of the European Union. And yesterday, in a debate with your compatriot Donald Tusk, I said that more and more people, in fact, are realizing that when we talk about the future of the European Union, there is emerging, in fact, a new world order. And this new world order, there's a world order where Europe is on its own, more and more. Let's recognize that. There is Putin, who is on a warpath. There is the Chinese leader that has nominated himself as the emperor for life. And there is Trump, who is openly questioning the transatlantic relationship. And by doing so, let's recognize that, also you can recognize that, I think, is putting at risk the security of the European continent. And for that reason, I think, and you didn't go in that proposal, but I think you can agree with it, that's the main reason we need the fastest as possible, I think, European defence community. And let there be no misunderstanding, Prime Minister, not as a body to compete with the NATO, but as a European pillar from the NATO, to strengthen the NATO, and to give the possibility also to the Europeans to act, I should say, on their own. But you have to know, with the European defence community, that certainly you can also be in favour of, is much more than simply pooling, how should I say it, a number of military budgets, of a number of tanks, or a number of aircrafts. A European defence community is primarily about defending European territory, defending European interests with European lives. And so that means that a European defence community as such can only work under one condition. And that is that we share the same European values, the same European democratic principles, the same rule of law, the same rules of the game that are fundamental in our society. Only then such a defence community can work in the future and defend our interests. So the future of the European Union, Prime Minister, and that is my message to you, is more than an internal market. Is more than a single currency alone. Is even more than only the free movement of people. Let me put it very bluntly. It's a community of values, and I have to tell you very openly that putting judges under political control is, in fact, makes no part of these values. You have to know that. And that is not a question of tradition, if I may say so, because I like also traditions, but it's not a question of traditions. That's a question of principles of our common community. And don't misunderstand me, Prime Minister, a reform of the judiciary is certainly a goal, a legitimate goal, but forcing judges to retire, delivering them to the will and the whim of the governing majority can never be part of such a reform. And over the past 3 years, what the Polish government has done, well, they have systematically liquidated the democratic check and balances. And I say that it's not this Parliament who has said that. It's the Venice Commission who said loud and clear that your reforms, and I quote now the Venice Commission, you're part of the Venice Commission, and I quote them, bore a striking resemblance with the institutions in the Soviet Union and its satellites. And I think that sums it all up, what they have said. So instead of what is happening now, rejecting 2 infringement procedures, ignoring the verdicts of the European Court of Justice, I use this occasion, Prime Minister, to an appeal to you personally. You were a youngster who was in fact engaging with Solidarność. You were part of the team that have negotiated directly the accession of Poland to the European Union. So I ask you personally, really, turn the wheel and bring Poland back into the family of democratic nations. Away of the illusion of so-called illiberal states, back and bring them back again, Poland. into the centre of European politics, instead of letting it linger at the fringes. This dream of an intermarum, the 12 Central and Eastern European countries from the Baltics to the Black Sea working together. It's a mirage, it's an illusion. Even Germany, Prime Minister, is a small nation today, even when many Germans maybe don't recognise it. It's only together, in a world of empires, Russia, China, that we can do it. And it's a big mistake, I have to tell you, to think that we can then fight on union in regional clusters. So I conclude, I believe a division of Europe, as it is the case now a little bit, let's be honest, is only welcomed by one man, one autocrat. That's Vladimir Putin. And Poland knows better than any other country what the fate is of our continent if the Tsar of Russia or the comrade of the Soviet Union is running the game in Europe. Don't play it. Thank you.
Per il gruppo dei Verdi la parola all'onorevole Ska Keller.
Dear Prime Minister, thank you for joining this debate on the future of Europe. And I want to stress that me and my group, we share the criticism on the rule of law that you've heard from almost all groups. So you can see that the Parliament is pretty united in that issue, and I don't think it's going to change. And you might say, okay, you don't care about what other people think about you. But I think you should care. It has been mentioned by the Commissioner already how important Poland is in Europe, but also how important Europe is for Poland, Poland being one of the biggest member states in the EU. And Polish people have a very positive image of the EU and actually trust European institutions more than they trust the Polish government. The EU contribution to Poland's economy in terms of many, many euros going every year to farmers, organisations, businesses has been mentioned. And many Polish citizens work elsewhere in the European Union. In fact, Poland has actually the highest number of migrants to other EU countries. You've mentioned Brexit, which will hit Poland hard, and you've mentioned Russia. That's why you should care. But also we care. The whole of Europe has much to thank to Poland. Poland was the first country on our continent with a modern constitution. You practically invented the division of powers. And that is actually then a Polish tradition, the separation of powers. Poland also has a long tradition of civil movements for freedom and democracy, from the resistance against the German occupation to the Solidarność movement, which was actually the first opposition movement to participate in free elections in a Soviet bloc nation since the 1940s. That's a tradition to really be proud of, and it gave hope to so many people all over Europe. So Poland could really be a shining example of democracy and the rule of law. But your government, Prime Minister, takes Poland away from the path of democracy and civil rights. You undermine the independence of courts. You put judges into retirement. You put judges under increasing political pressure as well. And you put people into prison who you think are not following your idea. And you even try to control political discourse and threaten the media freedom. But the rule of law and democracy are crucial for the future of Poland, and they're also crucial for the future of Europe. They are at the very heart of our union. And therefore, we as European Union altogether, we have to respond clearly and strongly to what's happening in Poland. We Greens fully support the Article 7 procedure, and we very much thank the Commission for also starting an infringement procedure in order to stop the Supreme Court Act. People wanted, and they still want to join the EU because they believe in the rule of law, they believe in democracy, they believe in good governance. And people in Poland protest against the dismissal of judges. They're standing up for women's rights. There's people marching against corruption in Europe. They carry all the blue flag of the European Union because they believe that the European Union is the body that can help them, that can support them, that will stand up for them. And we're very proud of the people who go to the street, who take to the street to stand up for their rights and their democracy and their rule of law. And those people, they are Poland too. And furthermore, they are Europe too. And we need to support them because rule of law and democracy really is the cornerstone of the European promise in Poland as well as elsewhere in Europe. And it's something that we as MEPs, as parliamentarians, we have to deliver on. It's the promise of the EU and we have to deliver on that. And that's why we as Greens, but also I think we in the whole Parliament, will never give up on these issues, especially since you keep adding new ones, like changing the law for the European Parliament elections, making it practically impossible for any smaller party to enter the European Union. The future of Europe really is in your hands as well, as is the future of the planet in Katowice, which unfortunately you didn't even mention in your speech, the very important conference there. And you could actually bring something into that, namely the idea that it also needs to be a fair transition for climate protection, that social rights need to be protected as well. Why don't you bring that in? Then you could really be also a forerunner on climate change to protect all of our planet in Katowice and beyond. You would even find allies in this house on many issues, such as Brexit, the rights of Polish workers abroad, on Nord Stream even, on social cohesion, you would find many allies. But if you want cooperation, then you have to stick to the basic rules of this community, a community that so many of your compatriots have worked so hard to build and to join, and that is the rule of law and democracy. You will have to deliver on that. Thank you and dziękuję.
Per il gruppo confederale della sinistra unitaria.
For the GUI group, Mrs. González Peñas.
Gracias, presidente. Señor.
Yes, thank you very much. President, thank you, Mr. Morawiecki, for your interesting presentation. Now, I get the impression that the reality of your speech and the reality of your country were very different. We have told you through our vote that Article 2 is being effective here. This is a macho, xenophobic policy that you want to impose on your country. Now you want to take control of the legal system, you want to affect the freedom of the media, and you want to restrict sexual and reproductive rights as well as the right to asylum. You are creating a breeding ground for very negative developments. Hundreds of people have been prosecuted for taking part in peaceful demonstrations. Peaceful demonstrations, well, that is against human rights. Now in Poland, we have a new law coming about abortion. This would seem to further limit the access to safe and legal abortion. There are women who need to have access to an abortion. For example, in cases of severe damage to the embryo, a large number of abortions take place for this reason. On Black Friday, there was a demonstration on a huge scale, and now the women are back on the streets. Women's lives should not be further threatened. Listen to these women, Mr. Morawiecki. Maybe you can't hear them because of the belling of the tolling of the church bells. Now, if you look back to 2016, there was humanitarian aid for Belarus. The European Court of Justice has ruled against you. There are measures that are being taken that go against the treaties and the Charter of Human Rights, including in the area of rule of law. What is happening in your country? Do you want to go down in history as the Prime Minister who destroyed the division of powers, the women's rights, the right to asylum, the rights of LGBT people? That's a hypocrisy, and it's a doublespeak on your part. Today's meeting is a clear example of that. The European Union has been merciless against Greece and forced a complete restructuring of the budget as a result of the debt situation. But here, what we're talking about is democratic rights, citizens' rights. The Commission now needs to take measures in this regard too. this is a development of authoritarian governments in Europe. We want a Europe where we can freely discuss economic policy, but also discuss freely about everything else too. Well, Mr. Legutko, maybe I didn't understand you properly initially. But as to the objectivity of my behaviour and the objectivity of the Parliament is clear. If you were referring to the exhibition on General Pilsudski, who I also consider to be a hero, then I'll remind you that this exhibition was not authorized simply because the documentation arrived too late. But once this is dealt with properly, then the exhibition will go ahead. There is absolutely nothing against Poland here, and my views on Mr. Korwin-Mikke's case have been repeated in the past. Now for the EFDD group, Mr. Batten.
Welcome, Mr. Morawiecki, and good morning to this debate on Europe. Now, in order to understand the future, we need to look a bit at the past. In 1949 onwards, there were two models in Europe. On the western side of the Iron Curtain, we had the model of the Anglo-Saxon USA Western liberal democracy, where peace was kept by NATO. And on the eastern side, where you had the misfortune to be, you had the communist tyranny model. Now, the Germans lost the shooting war, but they did not lose their ambitions. Now, Nazi Germany left us a legacy. Back in, I think it was 1942, when the Germans thought that they were going to win the war, they wrote a plan for how they were going to govern their new empire. And it was called the Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft, the European Economic Community. They were going to have interest rates linked to the Reichsmark. They were going to have a common agricultural policy, a common industrial policy, a common policy for everything. That plan resurfaced in 1957 as the European Economic Community. And Mr. Dombrovskis there naively mentioned Walter Hallstein, the first president of the European Commission, who was a lawyer who had happily worked for the Nazis. Well, how have things progressed since? Well, of course, communism collapsed in the East, thank God, and your countries eventually asserted their freedom. In the West, what happened? Well, the Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft progressed into a plan for a United States of Europe. Where is Europe heading? Well, there are two Europes. There's the Europe that's part of the European Union, and there's the Europe that isn't. Let's talk about all of it. Those parts of the European Union, where are they heading? They're heading towards a United States of Europe. We see increased integration in everything. We've heard about this defence community. I think that's called an army, isn't it, Mr. Verhofstadt, I believe, in other countries. We see full economic, political and financial governments being aspired to. The European Union now governs almost every aspect of the citizen's life. Mr. Morawiecki, you mentioned the freedom gene. Well, that's very strong in the British, and that reasserted itself in 2016 in the vote to leave the European Union. The British people voted to reassert their freedom and their independence. Sadly, that project has not yet been realised. The British people chose freedom over domination in an undemocratic European Union. Now, Poland, you've been a member of the European Union for the last 14 years, and it was entirely understandable why you joined, along with the other Eastern European countries. After languishing under communist tyranny for decades, you needed the financial subsidies from the European Union, and you wanted the opportunities for your younger people to be able to work abroad, earn money, and improve their lives. All of those things are understandable. But now things are looking up for Poland. Your economy is picking up, and you have personally invited many Poles to come back from their migration abroad and rebuild your economy. But you've discovered that there's a price to pay for European Union membership. The EU requires you to accept migrants in untold numbers, which would change your country and your culture beyond recognition, as indeed it has already in many parts of Europe. Not surprisingly, you and your government are opposing that forced acceptance of irregular migrants and refugees. But you've been threatened by the EU. If you do not take the migrants, then you cannot have the money. And you have found that when you have outside interference in your country from such as multi-billionaire George Soros, who seeks to interfere in your nation's life, as he does in mine, then the EU tells you you cannot oppose him. You have learnt that if you sell your soul, eventually someone will come to claim it. You can have the rule of law, but you cannot have the rule of your own law. You can only have the rule of this place law. You will see in Poland, I believe, in the course of time, that it was a wise decision that the British people made to leave. I would ask you, as we came to your assistance in 1939, that you in the Council come to our assistance. Please help us out with the utterly useless and incompetent Mrs May. Please help to facilitate our exit from the European Union in the Council and return the favour that we did you in 1939. Thank you.
Well said. Per il gruppo Europa del...
On behalf of the Europe of Nations and Freedom, Mr. Zoltek.
Panie premierze Morawiecki.
Prime Minister Morawiecki, looking at the 3 years of the current Polish government's work, I am of mixed emotions. Taxes are up instead of down, and you're buying one voter by losing another. There are greater entitlements for the secret services to surveil the Terrorist Act, for example, and the agricultural ground law would have been called Bolshevik 10 years ago. Bank accounts can now be blocked, websites can be blocked. Whenever the government wants to, these things can be closed down. There's no defence, and indeed the government doesn't need to give any grounds for doing that. Citizens' land can be sold without their approval by the authorities. There's also a need to register gold purchases, which harks back to communist times as well. I don't know why you're trying to make Russia, who's a friend, out to be an enemy. And America, it's not the same America as 30 years ago. Russia's not the same as 30 years ago. I do know, however, that the current goal of the EU is to destroy resistance to the European Commission and to force citizens into unquestioning subservience. That's why they're fighting with family ties, for example, because if you have a family strength, civil servants don't have so much power. That's why they're fighting with Christianity, because it's a competition for their governance. That's why they want a flood of Muslim immigrants in Europe, because if Europeans are afraid, then it's going to be easier to take away their liberties and easier to govern them. And that's why we have this terror of political correctness and homosexual rights. So therefore I'm very much behind your government's actions where they counter these plans of the European Union. I have one important question to you, Prime Minister. The European Commission has drafted a directive on digital copyright. This will close access to the internet to internet users. It gives the Commission a great deal of power. Citizens will only have one source of knowledge in the world, and that will be controlled by governments and the European Commission. Newspapers TV and a few internet sites will be all that's left. I would therefore ask you to give a clear statement, and not just something vague about I want freedom of expression, but I want you to specifically say whether or not, if Articles 11 and 13 of the directive remain unchanged, your government will support the directive in Council or whether it will veto it. I think millions of people are waiting for your answer to that question. Thank you very much.
The floor goes to Mr. Sośnierz for the non-attached members.
Miała to być debata o przyszłości Europy.
This was supposed to be a debate about the future of Europe, but with the exception of Mr. Batten, no one is actually sticking to the subject. They're simply engaging in a discourteous decrying of the Polish government, although they have no competence to do so. And Mr. Verhofstadt is the perfect example of that, and he has no qualifications to talk about Poland. We've talked about justice. Poland's have been defrauded when it comes to European subsidies. And now your government's trying to put social security into the constitution. And you're making us answer to European bureaucrats. Germany and France want a super state, a single army, a single budget, and we either sign up to it or we don't. They're the facts. We can't change anything about it. So the quicker we realise that, and the quicker we leave, the better. You talked about the freedom gene. People in Poland are not protesting against the retirement age of judges because no one actually cares, despite what the lady from the Greens said. People want to know about the Internet Directive's fate. Poland generally supports the directive. But if you don't want to get in trouble saying things like the freedom gene, then you should remember that it's not worth voting for directives that limit our freedom, but rather we should vote, and you should vote, against them. You're also limiting freedoms in your own backyard, banning Sunday trade or limiting the sales of agricultural land, for example. Let me just say to Mr. Tajani, we don't care about what you care about or not. My mandate comes from my voters, not from you, and I'm not going to let you tell me what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not allowed to say.
Nessuno ha mai detto quello che...
No one should put those words into my mouth. I just said I didn't think any head should roll. That would remind me of the regimes of Stalin and Hitler. Now, the Prime Minister of Poland, Mr. Morawiecki, to respond to those questions.
Panie Przewodniczący.
President, members of the House, thank you very much for your contributions to the debate, and thank you very much for reminding us of the principle of solidarity and how important it was in bringing down communism. Yes, I was a solidarity activist, and as a young man I went through very different experiences. Under martial law in the early 80s, judges sentenced my friends to 10 years in prison. Eva Kubasiewicz, a friend of mine, and others were sentenced to years in prison likewise. Some of my friends were killed. Some sat in prison for a very long time. Some of those judges from the martial law period, some who handed down shameful verdicts during the martial law period, are being defended in the Supreme Court, or sit in the Supreme Court, and you're defending them. Do you know that? Some of the judges from the martial law period are still present. So when we think about solidarity, we have to consider the fact that post-communism hasn't been beaten down yet, but that's what we're doing with our reform of the judiciary. Several members have talked about the European Defence Fund and its complementarity to NATO, and I thank Mr. Verhofstadt for developing that thread of the discussion. I agree, when it comes to the future of Europe, this is very, very important. And I'm very happy to hear that coming from the representative of a political group is usually considered to be quite far from my own group. So yes, in the terms of security, complementarity between EDF, PESC and NATO are essential. We're talking about complementarity, coherence, and so thank you for those comments. Let me just say something about another point Mr. Verhofstadt raised. Sometimes we're seen in the wrong light in Eastern Europe. The Trimarum initiative is not supposed to compete with the EU. It too is supposed to be complementary. Our partners from the West sometimes have difficulty understanding the Central European reality that we in Poland live in. Because you were very lucky, you were lucky enough not to suffer 50 years of communism. You were the right side of the Iron Curtain. But life in our countries was very different. And the transformation from 1989 onwards actually saw communists surviving untouched in the new system. We're now trying to throw off the post-communist yoke, and the Trimarum initiative is one way of developing a north-south corridor. Europe at the moment seems to be based on an east-west corridor, but the potential that Scandinavia, Germany, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia and further to the south still needs to be exploited better through the creating of better road, rail, energy and gas infrastructure. That's what the Trimarum initiative is trying to do. You have also, members of the European Parliament, mentioned retirement age. But do you know that a few hundred meters from here, the European Court of Human Rights brought in the very same rule, and judges were sent to early retirement. The same rule as we have introduced now. And then, when they introduced it, it was accepted. So what we're doing is nothing different to many other countries in the European Union already do. A number of you have talked about the Russian threat, and I thank you for those comments. We want to cooperate with Russia, but not with an aggressive Russia. We want to cooperate not with a Russia who is conquering country after country, not with a Russia that's trying to destabilize countries across Europe. We've seen that that's happening from statements made in countries across Europe, including Western Europe. Nord Stream 2 is something where we want solidarity from Western and Central Europe. We warn you of the threat that it represents, a threat that can affect Western Europe as well. It's really an extremely important issue. Mr. Verhofstadt, you said judges are under political control. Judges are more independent now than they were in the past, and I can demonstrate that. How do you show that a judge is independent? If the president of a court can appoint or sack or move judges from one case to another, is that independence? No. They're direct ways of influencing judges. In the past, one of the key judges in a regional court was happy to take a call from the Prime Minister. It turned out to be a journalistic host, but that judge clearly showed he was subservient to politicians in that particular case, and it was about the Amber Gold Pyramid Scheme case. They couldn't do that now. Today that would be impossible. We've reinforced judicial independence and objectivity. All the same, And Mr. Timmermans has admitted that. He's said that not being able to move judges between chambers, and that's something that we introduced, does lead to greater independence and greater objectivity and greater justice in rulings. So before you make statements like this, do have a closer look at the reality, at the truth of the matter when it comes to the rule of law. Judges are more independent now. And thank you for reminding me about the separation of powers. Our constitution of the 1st of May was indeed the first European constitution and did bring in that provision. Women's rights are something that we respect, and Poland was one of the first countries that brought in democratic rights for women in Europe. You've also talked about the media, ladies and gentlemen. When 80 to 90% of the media criticize the situation in a country and the government, is that free media? Doesn't it mean that it doesn't mean that they're threatened? In Poland, most media criticize the government, and we're happy with that. We understand that that is the situation. It's not objective, but it's the other side's view. And if you looked a little bit closer, you would see that. The opposition has no restrictions in terms of its access to the media. Journalists can pick up any subject they like and write about it. There's no restriction on that. But before we came to power, secret services were raiding newspapers' editorial offices. Did you say anything at the time when those raids were taking place under the previous government? My impression is that this parliament is partial. You might not like one government and you might prefer another government, but why didn't you look into this issue under the previous government? One of the main daily papers which was critical of that government saw editorial powers taken away from it and handed to an oligarch. So Poland was suffering oligarchization at the time. At the time, the media were basically run by a single political point of view. Is that freedom of expression and freedom of the media? Judges' work is defined by their conscience and professionalism now. That wasn't the case in the past. The changes that we've brought in mean that we've now got 10 billion euro out of the hands of the mafia. I think that you should acknowledge that, because this is money that belongs to the EU budget. Poland is a proud country. Please don't lecture us about this sort of thing. We know very well how to govern our own institutions. Because we've changed our approach to tax institutions, we now have the best economic setup in 30 years. Lowest deficit, lowest public debt, lowest employment, highest growth in GDP, highest economic growth. All of this whilst offering support for our social policy and offering support to, for example, the eradication of poverty. You should be proud of us for that sort of thing. We've reduced serious poverty among children. 99% reduction. Eradication of poverty. That didn't seem to interest anyone previously. We have taken money out of the hands of the mafia and given it back to social policy schemes. This is something that you would see, particularly on the left-hand side of the House. The Greens and the Socialists. If you looked into that, I'm sure you would support those measures. So do please take a closer look at our economic model. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy in Poland has never been so alive as it is today. Citizens' rights are unrestricted. the media is pluralized and free. If you look at our country, you'll see that that is the case. We're a proud nation, and we know the price of freedom, and you have underlined that, and I thank you for that. We fought for our freedom, we fought for your freedom. We stood up to Nazi barbarism in the Second World War, and we saved the continent from terrible genocide. It would have been even greater than it was. And we're not forgetting about our eastern neighbours. We support the integration of the Balkans into the EU so that we can complete the integration of the entire continent. Force in diversity. Yes, we recognise all of Europe's cultural heritage. Our support to security is not just coming from money going into defence budgets, but it also comes from our Eastern Partnership. But it's also seeing each other's point of view, respecting each other's point of view. Think for a minute. How is it the case that 90% of the media can be against our government? Big business, domestic and international business, is against our government. A big part of the European Parliament is probably against us too. And yet, all the same, in the country itself, we have very high support that goes beyond the support any other party has. There is something in the solidarity of our policies, there's something in the honesty of our policies that there wasn't under previous governments. And that also is tied to the weak judiciary under those governments. Did you know that 2 judges in the Supreme Administrative Court and the Constitutional Court colluded on rulings in the past? None of you said that that was inadmissible at the time, however. Now, to the Commission, Valdis, my friend, who I've talked to many times about economic and macroeconomic issues on many occasions. We've talked about the single currency, the financial crisis. These are subjects that we've discussed many, many times, and we speak the same language on many of these issues. And it's worth reiterating the positives that the Commission has brought up. The high quality of economic growth in Poland with a shrinking deficit and more efficiency in tax collection. I also thank Mr. Dombrovskis for what he said about our effort to enter into dialogue. I hope you heard that, everyone. We have done a lot to enter into dialogue. But I have to think whether or not the Commission is really an honest broker, as you call it. I was expecting polarisation as we have in Poland at the moment. I thought the Commission might be an honest broker, but is it really? We've made a great deal of efforts to reach out a hand. We've done some of what the Commission suggested in respect of the ordinary courts. But the submission to the European Court of Justice has not been withdrawn. We have the National Judiciary Council is elected with 3/5 of the votes. Show me somewhere else where you have such a democratic mandate for judges sitting on a similar body. Now, as Prime Minister, I've tried to dialogue with the Commission. I've tried to find compromise with the Commission. Today, I think we've come to a point in time where we've made changes. We want to reform the judiciary so that it's a better judiciary serving Poland and the whole of the European Union. Weakness is expressed in the failings that I have laid out in my dialogue with Messrs. Timmermans and Juncker. They know exactly our comments on this. There's also been talk about transatlantic relations, and they're very important, so let me just dwell on them for a moment. And I'd also like to say something about migration to conclude. In the context of transatlantic relations, Poland can hold back the anti-Americanism that we're seeing at the moment and maintain our relationship with the US. There's no better real guarantor of security, not just in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in the Middle East, than NATO. We very much support the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I want to bolster the EU as a single defence force. But to do that, we're going to have to go up to 4% of GDP spending on defence policy. Poland is actually one of the few NATO countries that meets that target of 2%, I beg your pardon, 2%. Other countries are not meeting that target. We are, again, I said, taking money from VAT mafia fraudsters and putting it towards the to defence spending. But until we have that sort of defence spending, then the alliance with the US is going to suffer. It's not just about being anti-American, it's anti-European to deny that. People who want to undermine NATO, undermine Europe. Only the Russians will be happy, as someone has said. Only Tsar Putin will be happy about that. Thank you also, ladies and gentlemen, for bringing up the issue of migration. We're aware of the fact that we have to help migrants and refugees in the source countries. I don't know if you know that Poland puts 4 times more into the funds like the European Resilience Initiative than it ought to according to its GDP. And I'll say more. We're happy to double our support to those third countries if other countries make the same contribution. Protecting external borders and offering support outside the EU, particularly in external hotspots, and then we talked about this at the European Council, is something that we support. We support the hotspots idea as a way of acting to help refugees. This is something that needs to be done. Now, you've talked about migration and accepting migrants. But in doing that, we're actually weakening some countries in the Middle East and Africa because it's the most capable, the most entrepreneurial who come to Europe. And in taking them, we're also weakening those countries, weakening their ability to reform their economies. And that's not something that we in Poland want to do. We very much support their own domestic development. To conclude and recap on this part of the discussion, let me say the following. Thank you, for example, to those of you who raised the future of Europe, including Mr. Verhofstadt. We see it as very positive when it comes to innovation, defence and migration. We want to positively contribute to the future of Europe in the best way possible. But it's not a good thing when proud nations are lectured to by others. That creates polarisation and a wrestling match. So we call for a dialogue. We've been a little bit disappointed by the Commission's stance so far. Please make the comparison with those countries that we based our reforms on, because we're simply introducing measures that have already been introduced in Western European countries. I would just say that Poland is a country of economic success today because of the new social policy model that we've brought in, because we've tightened up the tax system, and because at the same time we have looked to new ways of cooperating We've looked at innovation, we've looked at new ways of importing and exporting. These are also the strengths of Europe. These are things we want to offer up to Europe. We wish to be a constructive member state. And I think that despite appearances, despite the tensions that we can hear, I think that we can do that. We know that there are elections coming up and that tensions are rising. We'd like to stabilise the situation. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to rock the European boat, because we very much believe that European has a future. It has a great value, but we have to respect our national differences, our national experience and our national successes. Thank you very much.
Passiamo al Catch the Eye.
So that brings us to Catch the Eye. I'd like to call upon all of you to try and please put this in the context of the debate on the future of Europe. Mrs. Metsola.
Thank you. We cannot have a debate about the future of Europe without reaffirming our founding principles. And we need to reiterate, if the rule of law is under threat anywhere, then it is under threat everywhere. Either we are a union where the rule of law reigns, or we are no union at all. Because whatever the EU looks like in the future, and whatever the scenario, you cannot be a fit and proper EU member and undermine the judiciary at the same time. Reform by all means, but Mr. Prime Minister, what is happening in Poland is not about reform. It is about control. It is about consolidating power by weakening the institutions designed to keep you in check. That is the way of the past. To so many in Poland and across Europe, including my own country, Malta, the EU represents the fundamental belief, the unshakable certainty that however different we are as nations and peoples, however much we argue about policy, we share the same core value system. So the Commission is right, absolutely right to take action. It is doing its job, as it must everywhere there is a threat. The future of Europe and the future of Poland must be one and the same, based on the rule of law. Mr. Prime Minister, it is not too late. Come back from the brink, come back to the heart of Europe where Poland belongs.
Onorevole Weidenholzer.
Mr. Weidenholzer.
Thank you for coming, Prime Minister. I have great respect for the Polish nation. Without Poland, Europe would be a torso. I appreciate your contribution to bring down the communist dictatorship without bloodshed. The round table is a Polish invention. Your constitution was a paramount example for the rule of law. And I was also referring in my country, Austria, to the Polish example, and we could learn from the Polish developments after 1989. This is the reason why I am concerned about the developments in Poland, what is happening today at the Supreme Court, and what you have said in an interview for Deutsche Welle, where you said, I quote, "The law is not the most important thing. Human life, security is more important." So I ask whether this is really said by you, and do you really want the rule of law in your country? Thank you.
Onorevole Krasnodębski.
Mr. Krasnodębski.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, it seems that colleagues on this side of the House don't want to talk about the future of Europe, but they want to arrange how our country works. We talked about standards and values, but I think everyone should put their own house in order. Then Europe would look a bit different. And that's my appeal to the lady from Malta. Now, it seems that some people in this House feel that they took democracy to Poland and that they should be the custodians of it. But the situation is even worse than that, because some people give me the impression that they're trying to create some sort of new Iron Curtain, some new division. That's often because they're afraid of our competitiveness and our increasing sovereignty. Sometimes, couched in pro-European rhetoric, there's this idea that we should just reduce Europe to a suboptimal currency area. And so I'd therefore like to ask how you see the role of countries in our region in creating the unity in Europe.
Mrs. in 't Veld.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Prime Minister. You do not listen to the European Parliament, you do not listen to the Venice Commission, you do not listen to the Council for the Judiciary, you do not listen to the NGOs, you do not listen to the people who are protesting in the street and who supported the Supreme Court judge this morning. My question to you is, will you listen to the European Court of Justice when it rules? Do you acknowledge the authority of the European Court of Justice?
Yes or no?
Onorevole Sargentini.
Mrs. Sargentini.
No. Onorevole Verhofstadt.
Mr. Verhofstadt.
Sto cercando.
Well, excuse me, I'm trying. I will respond at the end of this debate. I'm trying to give everybody a chance to speak. Everyone who's asked for the floor. We haven't got a lot of time, though. We're supposed to finish it to 11:30. Mrs. Sargentini.
Thank you, President. Prime Minister, it would appear that you see that this debate is a type of a lesson for a proud people. I think that there's a misunderstanding here, because we're having a debate with a leader of a government, and a people is not a government. A nation is not a people, and a political party is not a government. And it is very, very important to really clear this point. If we're talking about a government, we're not talking about a people or a state. And if you see the situation in this way, it is then logical that there are dissident opinions which are creating an obstacle, because you're the state, the nation, it would appear. But dissidents' voices are there so that we can all control what we do, so that we don't have a society in which we don't work well together. We've got to accept criticism. If you don't let the judiciary act independently, it will simply not be possible to do away with these errors.
Spinelli.
Mrs. Spinelli.
Caro Primo Ministro.
Prime Minister, you know that this Parliament supports the Commission's decision to activate Article 7.1. There is a clear risk of a serious breach of the rule of law. This is a message that's not expressed to the Polish people, but to your government. Our concerns are not just about the independence of the judiciary. The European Charter of Fundamental Rights is being ignored. There's the right to freedom of assembly, the right to the freedom of the media. I hope that you will listen to civil society in its campaign against the Stop Abortion law, which is going to make even more restrictive a very restrictive situation. We do not want to see a return to absolute national sovereignty, ethnically homogeneous national sovereignty, religiously homogeneous sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Prime Minister of Poland. You spoke about the fact that the EU competencies should not go against the sovereignty of nations, but the proposal for abolishing unanimity, which will transform the EU into a union of 2 or 3 different velocities, does that agree with your principles? Many countries have closed their borders to stop the waves of illegal immigrants. This means that the countries of first entry, Greece and in particular Greece and Italy, will become enormous camps for poor people, for poor miserable people. And since Turkey is sending waves of illegal immigrants to Greece, and even threatens that it will open the doors to millions of illegal immigrants if we don't agree with their unreasonable demands, What should we do? What measures should we take vis-à-vis Turkey? Do you agree that there should be sanctions, such as the sanctions on Russia? Thank you.
Mrs. Gomes.
As a Portuguese who lived under totalitarian rule part of her life, I feel a lot of sympathy and admiration for the Polish people and their liberation from the totalitarian rule. But I can only share the concerns and the outrage of my colleagues who see the rule of law being put under attack by your government. And actually the people the brave people of Poland divided, as you've been putting slurs against people who are critics of your position, like some members of our parliament, like Rosa Thun and Danuta Hübner and Barbara Kudryka and other brave women who have been putting out and who have been slurred as anti-patriotic. I do believe that indeed the Polish people deserve much better. The Polish people is vibrant in the streets protesting against these attacks against the rule of the law and basic human rights, and in particular the rights of women. And I only pay tribute to the chief of the Supreme Court who went to work today, a brave Polish patriotic woman.
Onorevole Reding.
Mrs. Reding.
Prime Minister, you are leading a great nation and you are leading a great people. And they deserve nothing more and nothing less than a government which respects the democratic institutions for the sake of its own citizens. So why on earth are you dismantling your independent justice? Why don't you listen to the wise men and women of the Venice Commission, which expressed their deep concerns? Do you still respect the European Court of Justice? You have a responsibility for your country and for your people, so for God's sake, don't destroy the democratic basis on which your country is built. And give us back Poland as a reliable, constructive and influential member of the European family. You need it and we need it.
Honorable Schlein.
Mrs. Schlein.
Prime Minister, we are very worried about the illiberal choices of your majority. 3 simple messages. This new electoral law that you are trying to pass on the European election is a clear attempt to kill opposition parties by fixing natural threshold at 15–20%. You are attacking the principle of proportionality and the principle of representation by depriving a lot of Polish citizens of their voices. On women's rights, women have a right on their own body. Please stop attacking abortion rights. We support strongly the Czarny protest. And on migration, your attitude has been very childish, Prime Minister, because you're talking about cohesion policy and we all agree about that. But you cannot only choose and pick one form of solidarity and refusing the other one. You cannot want only the benefits of belonging to a great union without ever sharing the responsibility that come with it, so you should support the Dublin regulation reform that this Parliament has voted with a majority of 2/3. Thanks.
Onorevole Karski.
Szanowni Państwo.
Members of the House, Prime Minister, when we talk about the rule of law, we should set out some sort of standards. That wasn't present in Mr. Timmermans' reports. If we aren't in this House to sound like hypocrites, we have to beware and be aware of the fact that Poland has one of the highest rates of applications of rulings of the ECJ in the EU. In Poland, you can demonstrate freely. In other countries, they're broken up by police on horses, and that's in a country of someone who spoke against Poland today. In Poland, you don't have censorship on the media. For example, in Germany, when women were raped, the German media wouldn't report on that for several days. In Poland, we've introduced standards that have worked in other EU countries. Why aren't you speaking out against Spain? Because they have exactly the same model of a council for the judiciary. Why isn't there an Article 7 procedure against Germany, since Supreme Court judges are chosen by a committee made up of members of the Bundestag and members of the Ministry of Justice?
Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Prime Minister. Together with the Poles, the Greeks, other people in Portugal have got in the world rather have got the task of making the world a better place, safer and fairer. How are we to do that? We should do that by strengthening the community method, not by strengthening national selfishness in the Council. I've listened to your idea about the European Union 4.0 very carefully. If there are no common objectives and goals, solidarity in Europe is going to be forgotten about. I had been hoping to hear that you would finally commit Poland to the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. That is the way we should move to try to reduce division in society and to reduce housing problems and overcome all of the problems that we have. Rosa Luxemburg said the freedom of the individual is a precondition for the freedom of all. Mr. Schaffhauser.
Merci, Président.
Thank you, President. Prime Minister, what crime is Poland being accused of? The crime of truth. Poland is refusing to be subjected to the media and to their lies. The crime of justice. Poland is refusing massive migration imposed by Germany for its economic growth. The crime of sovereignty. Poland is refusing to let judges have this sovereign power over the people because justice should be in the name of the people. So in other words, the Union is blaming Poland for being Poland, to resist as best it can to the opposition of a new European order. A reorganization of our peoples and our nations. Poland is trying to maintain its identity. It's being accused of resisting a type of religion which is based on individualism, nihilism, a type of religion which is opposed to the real law of God and the law of mankind. Poland will remain Poland. It's been able to resist the Nazis and communism. Long live Poland.
Onorevole Thun.
Mrs. Thun.
Panie premierze, przedstawił pan...
Prime Minister, you've presented Poland as a country of mafia, thieves and bandits, which apparently was typical until 2 years ago. Your party took the reins of power, but not in our name. Not in our name is what citizens are shouting out today in Poland. Thousands of them are standing in front of Polish courts and the European Parliament and here in the public gallery. People here know how much we've achieved together with the EU over the last 10 years, and they know how your party is destroying that. People here know what breaking down the dependency of the judiciary means, sometimes on the basis of their own unfortunate experience. Prime Minister, you've shown that laws can be changed overnight. For example, the very unfortunate Holocaust law, which you changed in 9 hours 45 minutes. So you've still got time and the opportunity to withdraw the act on the Supreme Court. It won't be seen as weakness. You have the opportunity not to go down in history in the worst possible terms.
Sí, señor primer ministro, por este Parlamento han pasado ya 6 primeros ministros de otros países.
Prime Minister, We've already received 6 other prime ministers to speak about the future of Europe, and the common denominator of this is that we can only do together what must be done together. The European Union in the future must respect the needs of the main objectives by implementing them together. Prime Minister, do you think that it will be possible to ensure that Europe will be able to achieve competitiveness, that it will be able to deal with the environment and fight against tax fraud? Would it be possible to do this if only individual states operate? You've referred to the nation state, but we need to work together. We need to build the European Union together. How can we act alone only by enhancing the state nation?
Mr. Prime Minister, for me as a Swede, the emergence of Poland as a free and democratic country with the economic reforms of the 90s and the achievements in this decade belongs to one of the most impressive things in European development. We got a new neighbour, a new friend and a new partner in the middle and in the centre of European development. And I would like to underline to you that the debate here is not about Poland bashing. We love Poland. We want Poland to be there. But the European Union is a union of laws. And if you are undermining the rule of law, you are undermining trust. And you are undermining our strength for the future. Can you promise that you will follow the verdicts of the Venice Commission, the European Court of Justice and all the legal institutions that we have together?
Onorevole Mavrides.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Prime Minister, you mentioned to the Greco-Roman roots of our civilization and our Christian tradition. This is a historical reality that nobody contests. But what we do talk about is whether the European rule of law, the common rules, so that we can all live together and have a common future, all as Europeans. So the question is, if this is respected in Poland as well. This is what the issue is. Can we have European parliamentary democracy without the European rule of law? It's been already mentioned by Joseph. You said that security is above the law. This reminds me the other neo-Sultan, Erdogan, but you have no relationship to him.
Minister Morawiecki, Minister Szymański, you must be feeling like you have been thrown into a lion's pit this morning. We were supposed to discuss here the future of Europe, and instead we have had only more or less hysterical reactions against your government. Mr. President Tajani, you did say Europe must change, and if you had listened today to the presentation of this Prime Minister, you would have seen what kind of change we need. We don't need more Europe, we need more member state. And I would like to congratulate you, Mr. Prime Minister, for that courage. I think what we do need indeed is a Europe of sovereign nations. And I think the idea of a Europe of sovereign nations 2.0 is exactly what Charles de Gaulle wanted. And after Brexit, we have only one country in Europe which has this kind of common sense in the government. And that is yours, Mr. Prime Minister, and I thank you for it.
Avevo detto onorevole Engel.
Well, I actually said Mr. Engel, not Mr. Henkel. So Mr. Engel.
Cerchiamo di stare attenti.
Prime Minister, it's fun to talk about European dreams and not participating in European solidarity, isn't it? You wouldn't want to take 6,000 refugees. That's not a lot for a country of 40 million. You pretend to be a great country. You are a great country. You would be easily able to accommodate these. And at the same time, you talk to us about a Marshall Plan for Africa, while Poland is a country which does have no development ministry, no development agency, and invests 0.1% of its GNI into official development assistance. I don't think that makes a lot of sense then to talk about the Marshall Plan for Africa. But let's talk about Poland for a minute. You said we should listen to citizens and their concerns. I saw tens of thousands of Poles this morning who were freeing the way for President Gersdorf to be able to go back to work, to fulfil her constitutional terms of office. And it's your government that wants to deprive that courageous lady and the people who are protecting her way to work from their European endeavour, from being part of European normalcy. That is not a European dream, Prime Minister. That is a dream for a country which deserves the right one.
Per favore. Onorevole Rybacka.
Mrs. Rybacka.
Panie premierze. Prime Minister, we come from different political options. But for me and for you, Poland is our homeland. That is why I would like to protest against the great criticism of Poland that you included in the second part of your intervention. Please do not devalue the achievements of Poland only because they were not gained during your government. Poland is a country of proud people who deserve to be told that they worked honestly and they achieved a success. And now, as to the first part of your speech, I do agree with you that we need more of a single market, but you never mentioned the common currency. When will Poland join the Eurozone, in your opinion? When will you start the debate about that?
Gli ultimi due interventi, l'onorevole Gahler.
Mr. Gahler.
Prime Minister, I found some common positions.
Premjere, aš radau bendros pozicijos
on European security and defence, and your claim to engage more in Africa. When I supported the solidarity movement in the 80s, that the Polish communists denounced us as Zgniły Zachód, as rotten West. Today, when I read a translation of programmes of your public TV and radio, I'm getting the impression that we are already close to Zgniły Zachód again, when we insist that the rule of law and the separation of powers, the respect of your own constitution is demanded. I wonder, can you explain to me how a simple law can overrule an explicit provision in the constitution with regard to the duration of the mandate of a judge in the Supreme Court? On the future of Poland and Europe, state capture by a single party, that is not the future. Are you aware that your traumatised, angry old man, whom your government faithfully follows from the 21st to the 19th century, that this mindset is far closer to that of Vladimir Putin than that of any modern European leader? Should that be the future? Turn round Vladimir Morawiecki and jeszcze Polska nie zniknęła.
Last speaker, Mr. Zemke. And then the Prime Minister will respond.
Panie premierze.
Dear Prime Minister, there are some basic rules of the rule of law, meaning that there is no collective responsibility, no collective sanctions. The infringement and the punishments are applied to individual cases. Not so in Poland. We have laws introducing collective liability. There were people who, for one day, up to 1990, were involved in the work of Polish communist state institutions for one day, but still their retirement benefits have been painfully cut. Are you going to repeal those unjust legal acts? Are you going to withdraw a bill going in the same direction, extending those restrictions to officials and the military? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The debate is closed. Now the floor is for the Polish Prime Minister. You have 8-10 minutes for your answer. Thank you very much.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much for all your comments, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with the last one, perhaps. It's a very interesting aspect of defending the rule of law that we see among one of the MEPs, who is defending high special pensions for communist services, the services who murdered Polish heroes and who also assassinated people I knew. This is the difference between a part of our today's opposition and ourselves. We would like to change those rules, and that is why we have decreased the pensions to special agents of communist services, and we have increased the pensions of solidarity activists. That is the difference. Ladies and gentlemen, and no, we're definitely not going to change it. Mr. Member of the European Parliament, we're not going to change it for sure. Now, on values, ladies and gentlemen, we are on the same side. But you cannot definitely dictate the conditions of the rule of law to member states. The systems vary to a large extent, and you need to take account of those differences. That is also why it is in the exclusive competences of member states to regulate their justice and home affairs systems. This is not a part of acquis communautaire in the understanding of EU competencies. So, to answer the question whether Poland will respect the judgments of the European Court of Justice, I will respond, of course, Poland respects the judgments of ECJ. Right now, there are 50 judgments of ECJ that have not been implemented all around the EU. Poland does not have a problem with that, but at the same time, we need to underline that there are EU competencies transferred from the EU member states to the community, and there are also national competencies that remain, and justice falls within national competencies. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Parliament is right to want to be right in the centre of the debate about the EU, but you are unnecessarily boiling down that debate to the issues that fall within the exclusive competencies of member states. That is how we are wasting an opportunity of playing a key role in that debate, if not fully, at least partially, because one of the key elements are those that you have already mentioned, myself as well. So, single market and harmonizing economic rules where it makes sense. I'd like to point out to two areas: the freedom of services that might increase the competitiveness of the whole of the EU, and support for SMEs, because the large ones are coping, but there will not be support among the middle class. There will not be support for the idea of integration if there is no support among small and medium-sized enterprises. Mr. Jauregui Atondo asked a rhetorical question whether we should deal with such problems as making the VAT system leak-proof and getting rid of fiscal paradises. I do subscribe to that with my both hands. We have achieved great success. We have gotten rid of poverty among children. We want to now make the next step, but in order to do that, we need to act together, and Poland talks about that at every European Council, also the one that took place 1 week ago. We need to fight against VAT mafias, against fiscal criminals, and those who want to evade taxes. Of course, there were also many comments about the Eurozone. There are many questions asked and hanging there in the air. Many economists are wondering whether the Eurozone is creating problems or solving them. We are waiting for different banking system to cope with their problems, and we're trying to assist whenever we can. But today, well, I was a specialist. I used to be a specialist in optimum currency areas, and I can tell you that it makes sense to have a common currency among countries that have a similar level of microeconomic convergence. Poland is catching up with Western Europe because after the Second World War, we were left on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. Ladies and gentlemen, the three most important aspects to sum up. For Europe to be great and strong again, we need Europe 4.0. We need to be the leader of innovation, of the technological revolution. We are working closely in this respect with the European Commission. It's a very important part of our agenda. The second aspect is about safety and security. Thank you very much for your comments. I did not expect us to be speaking in one voice here. It is very optimistic. The same applies to our plans on Nord Stream 2 and the common defense policy. Thank you for your comments on Nord Stream 2. Thirdly, a politically sensitive Europe. Europe acting in favor of its citizens, defending its citizens against big global businesses. 100 years ago, the international companies started to dominate on the national markets. In response, we have created antitrust authorities. Today, we have global players dominating the market, meaning that we need antitrust bodies on the global level. We are in favor of the digital tax. We are in favor of fighting against tax evasion. We are in favor of fair distribution of revenue. The European middle class is composed of the middle classes in the national states. This middle class needs to regain its trust in the idea of Europe. Our proud European nations should continue to work together under a new vision of Europe. I'm deeply and firmly convinced it is possible, and thank you very much for all your feedback. Thank you for the critical comments as well. I think I managed to convince at least some of you that Poland has the right to reform its tax law, its justice system, its courts, because it falls within the remit of the member states. We are making Poland stronger. We are making one of the member states stronger, and we will continue in this vein. This will allow Poland to make a stronger contribution to the European project in the spirit of solidarity. Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for participating in this debate. It was lively, but certainly of great interest to all of us. It's always good for there to be debates as part of our democracy. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. The debate is concluded.